I want to start today by telling you about an email exchange today, or actually a Facebook exchange. A friend of mine was mad about the fact that he thought one of his posts was taken down because he started talking about Jane Fonda and putting something about what Barbara Walters had said that was not factual. And so his take was that it got taken down. And so I asked him basically, so why is it that you're dealing with a 50-year-old issue? Why is that important enough to you? Now, I don't think I said it real harshly, but he took it as real harshly. In fact, his response was, please stick all your liberal crap, something like that. But that's not what I want to talk about. I want to talk about another person who responded, and he went in a completely different way. I hadn't brought up anything about Black Lives Matter or anything like that, but Mark, this other man, said, and BLM upset about an issue that was addressed 150 years ago, and then again 50 years ago. But that's not a double standard, I suppose. The same divining rod goes both ways, my friend. I, for one, am appalled by the posts of kind and gentle people, or so I thought they were. The contempt that has been shown by liberals on Facebook and other forms of social media is at the same time surreal, alarming, and disturbing. To protest is one thing. To completely dump on your countrymen for not sharing a belief system is appalling. There is no defense for this behavior. It is not about what is right. It is about being angry for the sake of being angry. So ask yourself, Jim, what is the point of prolonged protests, complete disregard of the government, pissing on the flag that provides your freedom, and by the way, your right to have an opinion that defies objectivity and logic?
Wow.
That's amazing.
I thought it was an interesting model of exactly what we're going to talk about today. Right? Heavy defensiveness within that, heavy attack on certain places, and a narrative that goes way beyond what any of this was about. Why do people react that way is essentially what our topic is today. And how have we essentially acted that way at times? And how is it today that we either do react that way or don't stop someone else when they do? So today what I've been trying to do is address that with Mark and say, here's what I think is going on. And his stuff seems to be getting deeper into, but you're wrong. And you're not holding on to the party line and all the different things that are being described in this book. So what I guess I'm asking is, how do I deal with it? Give me some good advice from the chapters that you read this week to be able to help us sit in these spaces like this.
Good advice. Good advice.
Go ahead.
For me, I would say the first thing is try and find common ground with each other. Where do you guys have similar viewpoints? There has to be a common thread somewhere, at least from a humanity standpoint. And as far as what this guy is saying, yeah, I've seen that with even some of my more liberal associates up in Utah. If you're not all about their extreme left liberal viewpoint, you're totally in the wrong. They don't care. They don't want to find common ground. It's my way or you're an enemy. And they come right out and say that. So it's right in your face, and that doesn't work. You start doing that, and I don't care which side you're on. If you're going to be in your face like that, you're going to put people on the defensive. So you need to try and find some type of common thread that you can start talking about and try and work out these issues together.
Yeah. The hard part about that, and I do agree with you, Evelyn, the hard part about that is if we quickly go to one of those defensive spaces that they talked about, if we quickly see the other as the enemy, then we don't try to find that type of space. And I believe that's part of where we're at, especially on racial issues currently in the United States, is we quickly go there. I don't think I said anything in the original response to the post that was mean towards the person, or very strong. It was a question, it was a direct question of why is that important to you?
Sorry, I missed
Why
that.
is Jane Fonda offensive to you? And he immediately assumed the opposition to, which I do have opposition to that. But he responded very directly, please stick all your liberal, right?
No.
But you know, there is a human nature factor too. Amongst people, we tend to group together amongst similar minds and whatever. So you got your little individual communities or cliques that you associate with, and they automatically stick with that group mentality, beliefs, whatever, and they just become defensive for their little itty bitty pocket of the world.
Yeah.
And
Well, I
that's
think, yeah. What I think is particularly interesting and very germane to our topic in this book is that this is somebody from a majority, racially, economically. He comes from a position of strength in his society, and yet he holds a position of persecution. Look what you guys are doing to me.
Look what you guys are doing to me, really.
And I don't think that's been untypical through my life. Coming from Mormonism, Mormonism always has a sense of, look what you're doing to me. There's a persecution complex within that. But why is it that, because they were often a minority. I understand where that comes from. I don't understand how the majority politically in our society feels like they are being persecuted.
Why they're being persecuted.
And that's part of what we get in that white fragility. I think that's part of what I see, at least, is a sense of you're fighting me, you're hurting me, not a sense of what is it that maybe I've done? What is it that's going on? And
Jim,
that, yes.
can I just ask, how does he feel he is being persecuted or hurt? I mean, what specifics? Because I don't understand that viewpoint, but obviously enough people hold it that there's something going on that I'm not aware of.
Sure. Let me read a couple of different things where it is. The contempt that has been shown by liberals on Facebook and other forms of social media is at the same time surreal, alarming, and disturbing. So that's one of the places where Mark feels the persecution.
Can you say that again?
Contempt that has been shown by liberals on Facebook and other forms of social media is at the same time surreal, alarming, and disturbing.
Contempt. It sounds, I hear an awful lot of guilt that's submerged guilt, repressed guilt for what can't be undone. Well, I don't know.
I don't want this to be specifically about Mark and my conversation. I really want it to be the larger conversation about how else does this happen, and what do we do when we get into one of those situations where this is the dynamic that's going on. Because I think this is what Mr. D'Angelo is trying to say, is that we as white America very quickly go to that space. Paula.
I had a very troubling exchange on Facebook the other day with a lot of the same kinds of things thrown out. It was as if there was a total regurgitation of what this person had seen on Fox News the night before and what President Trump had been tweeting. And I was very troubled, and I almost didn't respond at all, which is the chicken way out, right? But I have a cousin who lives in South Texas in McAllen who tried to respond, and so then I felt I needed to. And I think, you know, generally speaking, in life, when I bump up against somebody and there's a really difficult situation, I like to sort of, you know, slow down a little bit and talk about what the situation was. When you said this, then I said that, and then you said this. This is how it made me feel.
Yeah.
You know, to be able to come from that place of, which I think we're also hearing in this book, of people authentically communicating how they feel about things that are going on, and trying to engage that way without putting the other person so much on the defensive.
Yeah. And it's
But I
hard
didn't
not
do
to,
that.
especially if someone is feeling defensive anyway.
Yeah.
With Mark, my last response was, okay, so I systematically, point by point, went through your things and addressed what you said. You came back and screamed about BLM and haven't addressed any of my points. I'm not certain that that's going to help him to feel less defensive or not. Right?
Yeah.
Leticia.
Can you catch me up on who Mark is?
Mark is just a friend of mine who responded quite negative to the, I mean, a friend of ours put a post up about Jane Fonda, right? Hanoi Jane Fonda, right? What she did and said. And I said, that was 50 years ago. Why is that so important to you today? And
Yeah.
Mark responded about this. And the tough part is that what he did, okay, so he starts off by saying that BLM is upset about that which was addressed first 150 years ago, and then again 50 years ago. And my response to that was addressed, but not solved, because I think he thinks it was solved 150 years ago. And we had to solve it 50 years ago again, because, and so that was my point, is you haven't addressed it. And here's my other point. You've taken a singular issue, right, where one thing is happening, one person was out of line, no matter how bad that is, and you're comparing it to a corporate thing, which is has been going on for centuries, and you're placing those side by side, and they are of equal weight in his mind.
Yeah, I gotta say, I've had a few responses over the last month where it's like, okay, Leticia, but we're talking about Black folk over here. Or we're talking about how terrible the Native Americans were treated. And one of the things, and it's here on Facebook, on other conversations, is that you don't understand the Blacks were taken from their land and brought here. But the Hispano-Latinos from Mexico, Central America, South America, they were a conquered people too.
Right.
And so since the 1400s, they've been very much enslaved. They just weren't taken away from their lands. But, and the institutional stuff, that article that I sent you about, how the term white trash came to be in the United States, that was really interesting. Because many of us, I know I didn't understand, and I'm pretty good in history, is that originally the colonies were established so that England could send what they called the waste people here. They looked at this land as waste, untamed, and they wanted to get rid of their indigent. They took children away from their parents and branded them and sent them out here to work, just like they did. It wasn't quite a penal colony, but it might as well have been. And I think human nature, it's not just what happened to the Blacks. I think it's what it was built on.
Yes.
Our founding fathers tried to get away from that. But even then, if you read the Federalist Papers, you had a bunch of people that hung on to that European ideal.
Yeah.
So it wasn't just the enslavement, it was that idea that America has a certain amount of waste people.
Yeah.
And,
Well, and I think that at least part of that is addressed when she said something along the lines of white supremacy is a form of trauma that is stored in our collective bodies. And all of that you're talking about, all of the rejection of like the pilgrims, right, that came over, that repression of in their countries of origin that was done to their religion got brought over here and perpetuated over here.
Yes. Yeah.
Even though we tried not to, we tried to write the ideal of what should happen. It was hard for us not to. And I think that's part of what we're continuing to deal with. Mike.
I found that first chapter, I was just fascinated with the word binary. I really didn't understand what the word meant. I had to look and, oh yeah, that's right. It's the either or way of dialoguing. And so when I get into a situation where it's I'm the worst guy and you're a better guy, I'm wondering, and I don't know because I'm not very good or haven't had the opportunities to get into this conversation. But if I say, you know, you and I are in a binary topic here that's eliminating 99% of what's involved with how we talk. And you're making a conclusion about me over one, maybe 5 or 10% of what's available around the subject. And so I think using that word binary to somebody who may not be familiar with it is a way to say, hey, hang on a minute. Let's make more interesting subjects here.
Yeah.
And so I found that very helpful for me to find a way to involve with a topic that really the context and all that stuff wasn't included.
Yeah.
But the difficulty is, Mike, of course, binaries are easy for us to grasp and understand, and so we quickly go to that. In this conversation, Mark at one point talked about you liberals always, right?
Yeah.
Which is a very typical thing of how we talk to each other, whether it's one looking at the right or one looking at the left. It's setting us into dichotomies where one side is always a lower side. And that's rarely helpful in the larger picture. It's very simple in an argument because I can say my way is good and your way is bad. And here's the reasons why. But in the larger picture, it's never that simplistic.
That's exactly what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I mean, I just think that when I hear that all you liberals are, that's going to hold on a minute.
Yeah. Or all
You tell
blacks.
me what that includes, and
Yeah.
it, you know, I'll deny it. And I anyway, maybe I'm trying to find a simple tool.
Yeah. The hard part, though, is that at least part of her point in here is that we do have to say all you whites, because we've gotten such an individualistic thing of I'm not racist, and so that must be fine. And in some ways, she is telling us that we do have to group that. But she did say at the beginning of chapter 7, she talked about how white insulation, exploring our collective racial identity interrupts a key privilege of dominance, the ability to see oneself only as an individual. But racial generalization also reinforced something problematic for people of color, the continual focus on their group identity. And so if I'm saying all of those, it puts a challenge that direction. Whereas I don't ever have to, as a person of the dominant culture, I don't ever have to say all of us. I can say Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Here's the rub though, Jim. Part of what minorities are fighting for is the right to be individual.
Right. That's the problem is that it's what needs to happen here versus what needs to happen here are two different things. And that's hard for us to figure out. But why we don't need that is because we have the privilege of already having that.
Mm-hmm.
We do.
We do. White America does. And by not recognizing it, and by not recognizing that some people lack that very same thing that we think we have, then we miss it. By not seeing what we are collectively, we miss it.
I said last week or the week before that it's very difficult for me because I was assimilated into an American culture, business-wise, culturally. What was even more difficult for me was when I was living back east, because here I fit a stereotypical idea of what the general public here considers Hispanic. I go to New York, I go to Virginia, New England, I get pegged for being Italian
Yeah.
and or Jewish in New York. And I don't have to deal with the same interactions. So it's been very confusing for me, even more confusing for my children who are physically, except for my son, white, right? And I think human nature wants to say there has to be a simple answer. And there's just no simple answer for complicated problems.
Yeah. Her first line in this chapter was, racism is complex and nuanced, and we don't want to deal with that. We want to make it simplistic.
And so much easier to generalize, isn't it?
It is, right? Part of that is because I know I'm not as racist as them, right? Whoever the them are. And Mark knows that as well, right? Mark knows that he's not as racist as some of the people around him or some of the people from his past or whatever it happens to be. And so he has at least some impetus behind his affront at being about being labeled racist. But that's because one of the things we easily do as individual white people in America is we know that we're not as racist. And so we can claim that. So we don't have to claim the generalized, but we benefit from.
Well, this is not a battle of comparisons to begin with. That's the hard part for me, is that we're all in this.
Yes.
And I'm at fault for saying, so I was active in the 60s. I did my thing. I marched, and I spent a lot of time and effort in hoping and working for change that was going to move people forward. And to a certain extent, I thought that it had really happened. And like Gloria Steinem said, I thought I did this work already. I mean, I was so, I guess, shocked by the fact that I had accepted racism, individual acts, as being kind of off the radar, that it was not systemic, but it was an individual act that had nothing to do with the systemic racism. And so I could pass it off and be happy to continue in my white, luxurious, preferential state. So there was this kind of, as she quoted, deep mortal wound that I felt when someone said to me, you're part of the problem. You've accepted all of those benefits of being white and in the same breath saying that you've worked very hard for racial equality, when in fact all you did was work and then accept whatever came that way as the final outcome of the work that was done, without questioning the work itself.
Yeah.
It never stops, and that was the thing. Damn it, why can't we get to the end of this? I don't expect to see the day when racial equality will really take place, but I hope to continue on that journey. I don't know what else.
Part of the reason why we can't get to the end of this is because it goes back much further than any of us want to admit.
Oh,
One of
yeah.
our very first stories in the Old Testament is a story of two brothers, one of whom killed the other, Cain and Abel, right? And do you remember what happened after Cain killed Abel? God put a mark on Cain so that everyone would recognize and not kill him. Okay?
Yeah.
A passage that has been used often to be able to say people with a mark of darker skin are the descendants of Cain.
Oh my gosh.
You know why I'm covering my mouth, don't you?
Yeah, but it
I
goes
lived
on.
in Utah.
Yeah, it goes on. When Noah, the flood killed everyone on the earth, he had 3 sons. Remember that?
Mhm.
Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And there's an odd story at the end of that cycle where Noah gets drunk, and 2 of the sons carry a blanket in and place it on him. But the 3rd son, Ham, looks on his father's nakedness.
Yeah.
And then they go into, right after that story, they go into who the descendants of all these 3 sons are. And Ham, the one who looked on his father's nakedness and often gets marked as carrying the mark of Cain, is the father of, listen to some of these names, the father of Cush, which is northeastern Africa, of Put, which is north central Africa, of Egypt, of Canaan. And his descendants are people like Nimrod and Nineveh and the Philistines and Babel and Sodom and Gomorrah, all those people who are the wrong side of the story in our Bible. And so much of this us against them, this mark against somebody else, is very deeply seated in us, in stories that we haven't even begun to understand, let alone encapsulate inside of ourselves.
Well, but I think that's more the fact that racists in the United States use that story.
I
because
agree
it's a
that
terrible bit of exegesis. It's not God who curses Ham.
Yeah.
It's Noah who curses Ham.
I agree, Harvey. I think that's all correct. But it doesn't change the fact that much of that type of teaching has been used by generations of Americans specifically to be able to say, this is why you don't want to, this is why they are, this is why.
Yeah.
And has been used to make it so that we easily do what Mark did, get defensive rather than get into a conversation.
And in my observances is that each of the minorities have learned that lesson very well, Jim.
Yeah.
They do it to each other.
Mhm.
And we've got a whole bunch of people that aren't willing to talk, that aren't willing to listen on both sides of the white, the ethnic, the political spectrums, that we've pulled it apart as about as far as we can pull it apart. And Evelyn said last week, she goes out with me and I talk to everybody about everything, all of this stuff. And it doesn't matter if I'm standing in line next to them at a convenience store or at the table at dinner.
Yeah.
But it's the only way we're going to get people talking.
Yeah. The hard part is that you have to overcome from chapter 7, that habitus that she spoke of, which is that which protects the disequilibrium. That when there's some kind of disruption in that those things which have been built up easily try to draw us back to. And so she told the story about the 2 white teachers, the one that she was mentoring because he had said something inappropriate racially. And then the way that another teacher had defended him, giving the example of the 2 girls, right? And she went point by point through some of the different ways that that their dynamics showed the dynamics of white fragility, that the teacher never considered that in not understanding the student's reaction, they might be tackling some knowledge or context. If we're right already, like Mark is right already in our conversation, and I'm often guilty of that same thing, so I don't want to just put it on him, but in the conversation, he doesn't even consider that maybe there's a good conversation to be had because he already is right. Where have you been guilty of that? How have you been guilty of that? They demonstrated no curiosity about the student's perspective or why she might have taken offense. How have you been guilty of that? I told you about one of my great learning experiences with Hispanic children, right? Had to do with the bathrooms. I had a little bathroom in my classroom, and I kept finding used toilet paper stuck in the cracks in the wall. Like, what was going on? Well, why are you sticking the toilet paper there? And you know why? Because in the countries that many of them had come from, you don't flush toilet paper. You put it in a receptacle, and I had no receptacle for them to place it in.
Context.
And I assumed that I was correct, where in reality, I wasn't understanding where they were coming from.
Yeah.
To go another step further, as I was that same year, as I'm trying to figure out how to correct these children, I did the very English Anglo thing of saying, look at me when I'm talking to you. And if you're saying that to a Hispanic child who has been taught since they were young, that when they are being corrected to look down as a sign of respect, then you're saying to them, be defiant to me as I am talking to you. And you're doing the opposite of what you want them to do. But if I don't understand that, if I don't hear that, if I don't see the nuances of their response to me, then I miss the opportunity in that moment. Leticia.
Jim, can you help me translate something that was told to me? This was an educator here in Tucson that worked with bilingual children in the Barrio district. And she told me one day, she goes, no, when their parents drop their children off to me, the Latino parents, they tell them I am their mother while they're here. And I know what Latino parents say. Te cuidas, respeto al instructor con respecto a tus padres, right? And it doesn't translate the same, right? It doesn't translate directly into English.
Yeah, as maestro, teacher, that was held at a much higher level than what most Anglos hold teacher. Maestro was a member of family in a very real way. And if we don't understand those dynamics, we miss what's going on.
But what was told to me is those parents are giving me, the teacher, their children as my own, and that's not what it means, right? One thing that Latina mothers are very protective baby bears, mama bears.
Yes.
And again, you know, I was raised with Spanish. I'm taking Spanish now from the beginning because I wasn't encouraged to speak it. Yet I do understand the nuances of the language. But when I first heard her say that, and we had to have a 2-week talk about this, that, yeah, the respect level needs to be there. And they do hold the maestro or maestra accountable for caring for their children as they would. But they're not relinquishing their responsibility to their children. to you, you know?
Right.
Yeah,
What they don't do, okay,
Can I get back to
yeah,
Black and psychological associations with, and you mentioned scripture where Blackness was seen evil. There is within our psyche the discomfort in seeing the dark side of our personalities. And
yes,
I grew up, admittedly, I have been reflecting on this, looking at anything that was black or dark as having some negative quality to it.
yeah,
And to fear that part of me that had a dark side, like crossing the street to avoid a black person because I'm afraid of my own darkness, of being harmed. I think the associations with black and the dark side of my personality and my very core of my being are real essential in this fragility thing
that's right.
that we're talking about.
Which is what, oh,
Because it's strong.
yeah, which is what her point was with the two different teachers. In the midst of doing something that had discriminatory implications written all over it, they took the best possible interpretation of their own actions
Mm-hmm.
at the expense of hearing or listening to at all what was going on beyond them.
Right.
And so the dynamics of what the kid was hearing when the one girl was called girl and the other girl corrected and said, oh, that's just what she says to everyone. The teacher should have heard, I believe, man, I see that one girl was upset by my use of that word with her. Instead, she said, well, this girl said that it's okay that I use this word with her. And so it
Right.
reinforced her bad spoken word rather than making her question if that was a good thing.
But also defensive on your part, on the
Yeah.
part of the teacher. That's defensive behavior, almost scapegoating behavior. I don't want to take accountability for something I misunderstood.
Yeah,
That's tough.
it is tough. But it means we have to be very honest about ourselves and try to be open to what the other person is feeling. And instead, it's very easy for us to excuse ourselves and see evil, if you will, in that
Yeah.
other person's behavior. And especially in race relations, this dynamic that she talked about habitus, makes it very simple for us to take easy solutions. Because much of that is about creating an equilibrium that continues and not letting it disrupt us, any of these little things. Evelyn.
Yeah, and part of the problem with this though is it's not unilateral, all white. Some of it's regional. I've lived in big cities as well as small communities like Globe here, and Northern Idaho, yeah, there was some white supremacy. After all, it was the home of the Aryan Nation for many years. But here in Globe, whites are actually the minority here and have been for some time.
Right.
You look at the businesses here, percentage of blacks is less than 1%. So there's only approximately 45 total blacks in this whole town. Two of the major employers, the top #1 manager, are black. The majority of businesses are owned by Hispanics, which happens to be the second most populous population. They're at 41% now. So, and I'm on a social site here on Facebook, and the attitude here, and someone came out and, pardon my language on part of this, they go, we really don't care what color a person is. We look at the work ethic, their attitudes, how they adjust, and plain and simple, you're an asshole or you're not an asshole, no matter what color. And that's how they view it. They look at the individual character of a person to determine how they respond to them.
Sure. And I think that's a pretty typical thing that we try to do. I think, to be fair, I think we're better at that than what our parents were. All right. The generation above ours was worse at doing that very thing you just said, Evelyn. But it doesn't take into account how much simpler it is for one group or another to be able to do something. For example, when they talked about affirmative action. Now, did you get the thrust of that whole discussion about affirmative action that she says? That whites always view it as those blacks are. And in reality, affirmative action has helped more whites than blacks proportionally. Not just the number, but proportionally, whites have profited from it more than.
I just found out that I had misunderstood many aspects of affirmative action myself.
That's right. That's right. And but that's because, Mary, we have heard in a lot of different ways the wrong white definition of affirmative action.
Yes. Yes.
That's right.
Okay, Art.
Yeah, I guess what I was surprised, I really did think that there were quotas associated with affirmative action. I don't know how I got that, but that was conceded. I really did believe that.
Yeah.
It's curious how that got into the story.
Yeah, it's because it's a convenient thing if I want to find a scapegoat, and people misuse that term all the time. Scapegoating is where you look at a minor thing instead of a major thing. Pure and simple, it's that. And so looking at, do blacks get more quotas, get more jobs that way? And so whether it's true or not, you use that minor thing to disqualify this huge thing.
I had a constant fight with a cousin of mine who drove a truck for Shell during this era when he was convinced that the blacks were getting his job. They were taking over even though they weren't qualified. And we would go around and around on this argument for forever. We could never resolve it. But
yeah, and partially that's because he's not trying to solve it. He's trying to get back to a space of equilibrium. Leticia.
I had a cousin who qualified for affirmative action. He had a learning disability. Not only was English his second language, born here in the United States, but he had dyslexia. But they recognized him for his mathematical ability. He ended up being one of the key designers of both Voyager programs. So there's those stories we'd never heard about.
Yeah. See, and it's really easy, for example, to be able to say, one of the points that Mark made in a later thing that I didn't read to you was whites are, let me get this right. Liberals are enabling blacks with all these handout programs, essentially, where we know that whites receive those types of programs more than what blacks do.
That's right.
But statistically, that's the narrative.
Yeah.
Because that's an easy narrative that perpetuates that which keeps an equilibrium that I don't want to break.
And most don't understand what kind of traps those programs are.
Right.
They're just designed to keep you there.
Yeah.
So
the question really for today is both how do we not fall into some of those triggers ourselves? How do we not believe the things that allow us to continue to missee people around us? Right? How do we not see some of the not true stories about affirmative action? But then how else do we address someone who does see it from that other place?
I know.
How do you talk to the marks in your life? And how do we help that conversation to be a better one than what it often has become?
One of the things that I have had to learn to do sometime is to confront somebody else and say, this does not feel like an equal exchange.
Yeah.
And see if that brings up an opening of some sort that will take the fire out of it, and let come to some agreement as to how the context of your life is different than mine, but your learning lessons have been different than mine. And the next thing you know, there might be a friendship.
Right.
The way it is right now, if you don't do that, there's no real communication. It's just a standoff.
Yeah.
And those are the kind of things that I think I mean, I remember in my business, we'd have people come in madder than hell on Monday morning because something happened to their tire. And they were there to tell me what I was going to do.
Yeah.
And I had to let them give up the whole darn story before I'd say, okay, this is what we will do.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's hard because, I mean, I get all the time where people come in and they want to tell their whole story. I already know the story and I know what they want. But you're right. Sometimes you have to hear the story. And you're going to maybe have to hear some of your discriminatory friends and family's story, even though they're wrong.
And also be willing to admit they are right about some of it.
That they may be right. That's exactly right. Art?
No, I was just going to say, I don't know whether I read it in this book or some other book. I've been reading so many different books, but you know, the thing is maybe if you get into conversations where people are saying things, I want to say, ask them or challenge them on their information. You know, well, where did you hear that? You know, instead of, you know, try to get them to flesh out where that thought has come from. And in doing so, sometimes they realize they just kind of pulled it out of the air. So, you know, that's one strategy that you can use in these situations.
And the hard part about that, Art, is that if it is a white supremacy that's coming from that trauma that is in our collective consciousness, you know, and they're going to try to avoid that trauma. And so they're going to easily go to that simplest place, the most comfortable space, rather than move through it to get a healing.
Yeah.
And you're going to have to fight with that. Evelyn.
Yeah, and there is one other thing. You're not going to be able to do this with everyone. There are a minority of people that will not open up to communication. They are just so set and so closed off that it is all their way or no way, that there are some you just need to walk away from and work on an approach somewhere else that hopefully they can pick up on it.
Yeah, it's tough, isn't it?
Mary has an answer for that. I knew it.
Good, Mary.
Biblical answer.
I do not. Evelyn, one of the things I have found, and I tell other people when they run up against, if I'm counseling somebody, they run up to this kind of block with another person, is the lesson that Jesus made in scripture that really struck me when I understood the context, was when he said, if you're not welcome, if someone doesn't welcome you into their home, wipe the dust off your feet as you leave the house. Well, the really important part of that piece is that because it's so dirty and dusty in the Middle East, you had to wipe off your feet, the dust off your feet, and leave your shoes outside as you entered the building. So if you're going to leave the building, the real insult is wiping your feet off when you leave. So that it stands as when Jesus said, if you're not welcome, wipe off your feet as you leave. So that it's an insult to the person. They don't, you know, anyway. It always made me feel better to say that I understand that sometimes there are people for whom I cannot find reconciliation and I'm making no headway. And there are plenty of other people who are going to be out there who are going to welcome some new understanding.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
The difficulty is when it comes right down to it, remember, your job is not to fix the marks of the world, right?
Yes.
That your job is to be the very best possible Jim or Art or Leticia, right? And to do that, you have to figure out how to not give into the habitus, right? But to allow that disequilibrium to stir and challenge your soul, right? And then maybe in that healing motion of you, maybe you can bring some other people on. That doesn't mean that I shouldn't answer Mark's stupidity on here. Okay, that's not what I'm saying. You should talk directly about it, but your job ultimately is not to fix that. It's to be a better version of you in these areas. Leticia.
Mike, I wanted to tell you, I don't know what I call myself. I've worked within the Latino community, within multicultural communities for over 30 years here and in Utah. And I have the same struggle trying to be an empowerment activist, right? Trying to say, don't get hung up on the victimhood.
Yeah.
Don't get hung up on the oppression, because we lose what we can gain from other people, whether it's worried about them taking over, whoever them are, or worried about being oppressed. We in that worry, we stop looking at each other as people.
Right.
Nothing else, just people. And so I look at the communication issues. Yeah, I get what D'Angelo is talking about, because I've lived it. But at the same token, I can't let it paralyze me either.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, in the midst of all this, right? What are some of the triggers for you? And these might not be triggers that are the racist triggers that allow you to go into your support of the goodness that you receive from a racist system. But it's also, what are the triggers that put it so that you don't help the other person move as easily towards something that's better? When they say
The
something.
trigger for me is when somebody looks me in the face and says, "You're absolutely wrong."
Yeah, that's hard.
I remember a guy, we knew a doctor once who was a radiologist, and he was very good at telling people, "You're absolutely wrong." So we brought him a sign to put on his desk, so that when you walked in there, you knew you're going to be absolutely wrong.
Yeah. But one of my triggers, Mike, is that some people don't believe me when I tell them they're absolutely wrong.
I don't believe it either. I mean,
Who else?
Like the fake information, you know. You get so many people who believe some of the dumbest things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And have been empowered to call anything other than what they believe fake news.
Yes. Yes.
Well, we just realized Art said the same thing, that I did not understand the affirmative action policy. It's been so long, I bought into some of the myths around that, like the quota system. So look what's happened. We buy into our own fake news without questioning it.
Yeah. My granddaddy used to say something about Elias used a story that you've told long enough that you believe it's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we do that a lot, don't we?
Yeah, we do.
The question is, how do we step into those spaces where someone challenges one of our stories or we challenge one of their stories, and make it so it's a fruitful conversation rather than one where we immediately argue, push away, reject.
Well, how do we diffuse the energy that exists when the energy is focused on only that particular?
Yeah. I think it helps when, I think one of the big reasons why she has pushed hard on us to know that racism is a systemic thing, not an individual thing, is so that we can step away from "you're racist, I'm racist." So it's not the pointing of fingers that way. I think we have to have to change that conversation so it doesn't go back to that. So people don't become defensive about what they know they're not, at least as much as their parents. I'm not as racist as my parents. But that's not where we want to keep the conversation. We have to keep it on the systemic level.
Well, interestingly, there's a hearing going on. In fact, it's probably over now in chambers. I don't know if it's in the House or the Senate. The fact of the matter is, I didn't pay attention to that. But they're talking about systemic racism, and I doubt that. My initial reaction is, I don't know that they understand the difference between systemic and regular, or individual acts or events.
But think about that,
I think
Mary.
the conversation's beginning.
Yeah, think about that. That's because for 50 years, since everything that got passed in the 1960s and all of that great movement we've done a whole bunch of stuff that has said, don't you be racist. And so we've literally trained ourselves into thinking that racism can't exist in me because I'm relatively good.
Relative.
And that's a lot of momentum. That's a lot of storytelling that we have to overcome in our heads. And so our generations may not be able to overcome that, but we have to start telling the right story. So that as it moves forward, there's a chance that it can continue to be overcome.
Yeah.
I want to encourage you to watch a movie. It's called Rosewood.
Oh, yeah.
It's a great movie. It was made back in the late 80s, early 90s, something like that. And it's about a particularly horrendous event that happened in Florida in the early part of last century, where essentially the wrong story was told because it was convenient.
What's the name of it? With Sally Field?
No. It stars, why is his name slipping out of my head? He was the man who was who was Tom Cruise's compatriot on the Mission Impossible movies.
Okay, yeah.
Big solid man, broad shoulders. Why can't I think of his name? Anyway, it's called Rosewood. Rosewwood. If you need to borrow a copy of it, I have it here. But it talks about many of these things here. Basically, the setup is just white community and black community living side by side, all having an interdependence on each other, and then racially things go awry. So a lot of deep stuff today.
Yeah.
You didn't solve much of it.
No.
Darn.
Might take a little more time.
It might take a little more time, but the truth of the matter is we got 2 or 3 more weeks to solve it all.
Oh,
But
good.
we did agree this was complicated. At least we agreed it
That's
was
right.
complicated.
That's right. Evelyn.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's one more struggle we have as a society with the time factor. We're in a society now of instant gratification.
Yeah.
We want food. We go to a McDonald's, whatever. We have it now, snap of our fingers. And so when we're presented with something like this, that is going to take a lot of time, a lot of thought. It's just something we're not used to as a society.
Good point.
Yeah.
A lot of understanding as well, if I can say it that way. Because my friend Mark is a good friend, and I like Mark a lot. Mark was very important to much of my journey. And so I don't want to say you're just wrong, Mark, because I know he has a lot of right to him. So how do we stay in that conversation so that he can continue to hear that? and I can continue to glean from the part that is right. Peggy.
No, I didn't.
Oh, I saw your hand.
Sorry.
All right.
Yes.
Continue to work on it. Continue
Okay.
to be very aware of your world and how you're dealing with people, because there's a lot of stuff out there that's happening on a regular basis. This is particularly fertile ground to be able to see if we choose to. All right. Unlike where it's been very hidden in the past, it's very in the open right now. So help yourself. Invite yourself to be open to what's going on, and invite others around you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Jim.
See you now.
Thank
Hi,
you.
everybody.